Welcome to the Spring 2021 Communication Arts Conference at Judson University. My name is Warren Anderson, and I'm the director of the DeMoss Center for Worship in the Performing Arts. We are here in Thompson Hall in the basement in Doc Ryder Studio B, and this is where we are doing our Communication Arts Conference again this year, virtually, as we did last fall. As for thank yous, let's go ahead and thank, first of all, Dr. Stuart Ryder, Professor Emeritus, and our Darkroom Studios patron. Thank you, Doc, for your continued benevolence to the Communication Arts Department, of which you were such a key founding member. We want to thank Jeff Flickema and his team with the Judson University production team. Thank you, Jeff. And to Professor Tim May, who is our Darkroom Studios manager, for all of the work that he is doing to pull this together as well. And we want to thank in advance the students who are giving their presentations, the communication arts students and the worship arts students, for what is going to be, I trust, a very wonderful series of presentations. Would you pray with me as we begin? Sovereign God, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. We are grateful that before time began as we understand it, you spoke this world into existence, setting in motion very clearly that communication is integral to your kingdom's work. And so we'd ask that you would bless these students as they present now. Give them a great sense of calm and of encouragement and of confidence that you will speak through them as they honor you by returning the gifts that you've given them to your service in this conference. We pray all of this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Enjoy the presentations.
My name is Devin Wright, and this is the compelling narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to ask you a question. What is your favorite movie? It's a question that I'm sure you've heard before, maybe at a social event or on the first day of class. Don't worry, you don't need to share. I can't hear you anyway, but I ask because your answer is important. This question, what is your favorite movie? It's a litmus test that serves to tell others more about you. Communication theory tells us that who we are, how we speak, how we eat, how we perceive the world around us, and even our posture is determined in large part by the media we consume. Your favorite movie is probably your favorite because you have grown in some way just by watching it. For me, the movies I grew up with, like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, they have made me want to emulate the characters in those movies, and thus, that has given me a craving for adventure, to go off and explore the world just as they do. It's for this reason that I believe cinema is by far the greatest invention of the 20th century, because of how it has such a profound effect on our society. It's just ironic because, well, filmmaking is such a difficult process. I mean, with a book, you might have 1 to 2 writers and a couple editors at the most. But with a film, you have to worry about your actors, your screenwriters, costume production, cinematography, all while having to operate under a studio-approved budget. There are so many moving parts, so much that could go wrong at one time. It's amazing these films are any good to begin with. That is why one of my favorite pastimes is breaking down these movies to see where they work and how they might fall short. While I could break down the whole filmmaking process, I thought it would be best to cut away the weeds and instead focus on something that I'm at least somewhat qualified to discuss: the story. After all, the story is the most important part. Without it, the rest would fall like a house of cards. The information I'm about to share with you focuses on what you need to write a compelling narrative, regardless if you're a screenwriter, an author, or a dad sitting around a campfire. It's as simple as asking yourself these 3 questions. Does the story make sense? Does it represent reality? And does the audience care about your characters? A writer doesn't necessarily need to follow this formula in order to make a good story, but great movies, books, TV shows, and even speeches can confidently answer these questions. So let's begin with the first one. Does the story make sense? Admittedly, this is the easiest question to answer. If you can't comprehend the events that take place in your story, then odds are your audience won't have a clue either. You need to give a clear reason why your story is moving in the direction you want it to go. But I would take that one step further and say you need to make it a good reason that serves not just to develop your characters, but the world they inhabit as well. A story that does this really well is The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is centered around the destruction of the One Ring. Right away, it is established that evil cannot be defeated as long as the ring exists. And the only way to destroy the ring is to cast it into the volcano it was forged in. Thus, our heroes need to get there before evil consumes the world. We have our point A, our point B, our reason for getting there, and what should happen if our heroes fail. It's pretty simple, but it makes sense. As our characters embark on this journey, they encounter different roadblocks along the way that serve to show the audience the dangers that lie beyond. Ghoul-infested mines, corrupted leaders, and scorched landscapes, all reminders of the impending threat. Your reason for getting to point B should serve to complement the world and build your characters beyond just flat and basic archetypes. Something important to keep in mind is the intelligence of your audience. As a writer, you should never assume that they won't notice a flaw or inconsistency in your story. And this applies especially if you are writing to children. Our brains are excellent when it comes to detecting these errors. We are so good at it, in fact, that you might not even know that there is an inconsistency, but your mind will tell you that something is wrong by making you feel some form of discomfort. This phenomenon relates directly to the second question: does the story represent reality? Or, in other words, does it allow you to suspend your disbelief? For those of you who don't know, the suspension of disbelief is the threshold one has to cross in order to find something believable. The extent of this threshold is different depending on the type of story, but it occurs in every form of communication. Now, when I ask the question, does it represent reality, that doesn't mean that it necessarily has to mirror our reality. Some of the best stories being told right now involve a super soldier, a god of thunder, and a man whose strength depends on how upset he is that day. These three are unfathomable in the real world, but they are believable because they follow a consistent set of rules that are logical, just like we do. As the writer, you have the freedom to create these rules as you see fit, but keep in mind that the term rule has very broad implications. They don't just dictate how your universe works, but who your characters are, how their superpowers work, if they're superhuman, and how they behave in certain situations. You need to be careful because you have to uphold these rules. Otherwise, your audience will lose their suspension of disbelief and they will stop caring about your story. I call this the Batman conundrum. Batman is a cultural icon, and whether you have seen any of his movies or not, you are likely to be familiar with this. Batman does not use guns, and he does not kill. Countless Batman stories revolve around this. His villains see it as a weakness, and they frequently take advantage of it. To the audience, this rule has become synonymous with the character. It's what we come to expect from a Batman movie. So if a writer were to depict Batman killing people with guns, they would have to reasonably justify the change or have the audience be yanked out of the story wondering, hey, what the heck just happened? This might sound like an annoying crutch, but the truth is you can have a lot of fun despite the potential restrictions. For instance, in the movie called Baby Driver, the main character is constantly listening to music in order to tune out his tinnitus. Thus, the events of the film move to the beat of whatever he is listening to. My favorite example of this is when a car chase with the police is put on hold because the main character has to restart a song. As long as you abide by the rules that you put in place, your freedom as a writer is still unrestricted. Lastly, there is the final question. Does the audience care about your characters? This is the most important part because it is often the most misunderstood. According to John Truby, a screenwriter with over 1,000 films under his belt, quote, "Many writers think the way to make the audience care about a character is by making them as detailed as possible," meaning they add as many character traits as they can. This is not the way to go. What makes an audience care about a character comes down to only two things: the fundamental weakness of that character and their goal in the story. End quote. By nature, human beings are flawed, and we acknowledge, challenge, and hate those flaws every single day. Thus, it might seem contradictory to make your hero a broken character, as we often look to media as an escape from our broken selves. But the truth is that if you allow your hero to confront their flaws and conquer them, that is what makes a character compelling. What John Truby is saying is that the character's motivation to get from point A to point B should at some point force them to confront and conquer their flaws. A few minutes ago, I asked you what your favorite film was. Even though it's a simple notion, I believe your answer has everything to do with your cultural upbringing. And now that I have shared what I believe are the vital ingredients to make a compelling story, I ask that you look at your favorite film or book or whatever and see how it stands up to these three questions. How does it make sense? Does it represent reality? And why do you care? It could help you discover more about yourself, or it could help improve your communication. Cinema might seem like an elevated form of storytelling compared to the type of communication that we do every day. But the truth is that these points are valuable even in our face-to-face conversations. It's all about how we convey information.
All right, Devin, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, appreciate it. I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer a few questions now. And the first I want to take from the very end of your speech, where you referenced the fact that the answer to the question that you posed at the beginning of your speech for every member who's in your audience is going to change a little bit based on their cultural upbringing or the circumstances around affecting their culture. So, given that you are currently taking intercultural communications and have had an opportunity to see some wonderful films, how would you say, in a nutshell, this is a huge long argument, but how would you say that culture affects your basic 3 points? In what way would someone's culture maybe influence all three or any one of those points?
That's a really good question. I think what it comes down to is everyone has different customs, different tastes, and different social norms. For me, if I were to do something that would be obscene here, it might have a completely different meaning elsewhere. So I think the best way to, I suppose, adapt would be to educate yourself. See how everyone in another country is digesting their stories and how they're basically holding up to these three, and then you should be able to say to yourself, okay, I can adjust this, that, and the other thing so that I don't offend if I were to give a presentation there, if that answers your question.
Sure. In a 10-minute speech, you always have to leave really good stuff on the cutting room floor. What In relation to your primary thesis, what did you not tell us in your speech that if you had had more time, you would have shared with us?
Probably everything I have learned about communication theory this semester, and my entire life of wanting to break down how stories work. It's been kind of a passion piece for me because I have been learning so much about communication and how it relates to storytelling. As you know, I strive to be a professional storyteller someday. So when I said that one of my favorite pastimes is breaking down films, it's something that started back when I was a little kid. I was like, how do they make it so that I cry when someone dies or there's a certain emotional scene in a film? And I'm learning now in communication theory that the emotion and everything that can be conveyed in a book or a movie, it has everything to do with communication, and we do it on a very personal level. One of the theories that we're discussing right now states that all communication, even what we're doing right now, consists of miniature storytelling. So that's what I was trying to convey with my speech, but there's so much information that I had to leave because of that.
Sure. How would you answer the question that you posed at the beginning of your speech for yourself?
What is your favorite movie?
Yes.
My favorite movie right now would have to be a movie called Jojo Rabbit. Because I believe that good movies don't just make you feel one emotion. They make you feel an entire roller coaster of things. Jojo Rabbit is a satirical comedy that takes place in World War II, Nazi Germany, but it is an anti-hate message. And it makes you laugh, it makes you cry, and it just... I came out of the theater when I saw that movie for the first time feeling something different. At the beginning, I said that your favorite film is probably your favorite because you have grown in some way just by watching it. That would be the case for me. It's given me a appreciation for the different struggles that someone might go through and how you really need to see the full picture in order to understand that.
Last question, probably the most important question for you all day. Since you mentioned members of both, MCU or DC?
Can I say both? The MCU, the movies, I think have been fantastic. I never grew up with Marvel. I grew up with DC, but I think that the Marvel movies are excellent for a variety of different reasons that would take us forever. However, I think that the DC TV shows, like the old cartoons of Superman, the Justice League, so on and so forth, those are the characters that I stick with. And to be honest, if it's on, I'll rewatch it any day.
Thank you very much.
My name is Emma Lepke, and the title of my presentation is The Effects of Social Media on Generation Z. Does social media tie into the decline of mental health? Social media has been on the rise for years now. Each year, we see a new upgrade or a new social media platform come out. Now, this generation is spending more and more time on social media and less time outside. According to Victoria Benton in her book titled Teen Mental Health in an Online World, young people who spend more than 6 hours online outside of school are more likely to report that they are not satisfied with their life or they feel lonely, which suggests that the ability to balance internet use with other activities and interests is salient to positive mental health and well-being. Throughout this research, I have found that there are underlying effects of social media on this generation. I will share the effects of problematic social media use, mental health issues, cyberbullying, and even suicide due to the increase of social media in this generation. Finally, this research will show that Generation Z should probably put down their phones and practice a little bit more of a relaxing lifestyle. So, to start off, who is Generation Z? To be in this generation, one would have to be born in the years between 1997 and 2012. So they are actually the most anxious generation. Tim Elmore and Andrew McPeak did a study on this most anxious generation, and they are anxious because of the constant social media time surrounding them. And they're also extremely restless because they are putting in that screen time instead of sleeping. They're also very tech savvy, which turns out not to be as helpful as we think. Because according to a 2018 study done by the National Institutes of Health, kids who use smartphones, tablets, and video games more than 7 hours a day are more likely to experience premature thinning of the cortex, which is the outermost layer of the brain that processes thought and action. And lastly, they are very acceptive. Generation Z cares much about equality. They are more inclusive and accepting of different races, sexual orientations, backgrounds, or gender than any other US generation before them. Now, since social media is such a priority in this world, it comes with addiction and attachment anxiety. Attachment anxiety first starts when we feel a sense of belonging on social media. They get obsessed with the amount of likes or comments that they get in a post. And Gen Z will feel like they need to constantly be updating their profile, and soon enough, it'll change from that attachment anxiety to that addiction. So in what ways do we specifically get addicted to social networking sites? For example, with online friendships, you can only give out a certain amount of information. So the online friend is more impartial as they can only analyze and respond to the information that you give them. At first, this doesn't seem like a terrible thing, but over time, when they put so much of their life into it, they could potentially become unsatisfied with the real world because they are only putting their best side, or the side that people want them to see, on social media. They're almost putting a different persona of themselves online to satisfy those who the posts, messages, or blogs meet. Social media addiction is a real thing, and it needs to be taken care of before it gets worse. So not only does social media addiction and attachment anxiety is an effect of social media on this generation, it also causes mental health issues and different personality traits. When it comes to mental health, stress and anxiety are one of the leading causes of depression seen today. A leading cause of stress can be social media. So time spent on social media maintaining their profiles or pages can cause them stress. Gen Z could be spending much of their time dealing and thinking about the way that they look. If they were to go on somebody's profile and see that they are better looking than themselves, this would cause insecurity, and then that would lead to stress on themselves. So then, putting on so much stress from social media can end up leading to depression. Most studies have shown that looking at others' profiles of their lives, for example, others going on vacations, to parties, or to events that they were not invited to, can trigger them to feel lonely or have FOMO, which means fear of missing out. This stress from feeling lonely can cause Gen Z to then, in turn, become depressed. Another leading cause of depression is lack of sleep. Many times, teens and college students will find themselves on their phones right when they wake up and right when they go to bed. Now, the blue light on the phone actually can trigger the circadian rhythm in our brains and make the brain think that it needs to stay awake, even though it is well past their bedtime. Now, stress, anxiety, and depression are already pretty big effects of social media. But struggling with different personality traits is also an effect of social media that is on this generation. Most of the reasons why personality traits are portrayed differently on social media are the need to belong and the need to fit in, just like we were talking about before with the amount of likes and comments one gets on a post. So they would only put their happy or their perfect side forward when in reality they're not happy nor are they perfect. The changing in personality traits can often lead to creating multiple identities online known as the distributed self. This means that one can switch personas at will or even create a multitude of social medias varying from day to day. Now, this can lead to loss of self-awareness. Another study done by Sherry Bauman says that completely hiding one's identity or creating an online identity that does not reflect the online self could, in theory, result in a reduction or loss of self-awareness, thus promoting a more extreme or uncharacteristic behavior online. Now, moving forward, let's talk about cyberbullying. With the increase of technology, we see that there are more and more cyberbullying cases happening all the time. Now, in this generation, there has actually been an increase of cyberbullying on college campuses. Pavika Sheldon states in her book titled The Dark Side of Social Media that cyberbullying among college students reveals that 46.1% of the targets reported text messaging as the most frequent medium for cyberbullying, followed by 43.5% reporting email and 32.2% reporting websites. Now, cyberbullying can happen in many different ways. These ways can include the posting of hurtful comments online, threats and intimidation towards others with the online space, posting photographs or videos that are intended to cause distress or disgust, inciting others to make hurtful comments aimed at a person, or sending hurtful text messages on a smartphone. Anything and everything can stay online once you put it there. Now, cyberbullying has increased over the time that technology has. Cyberbullying is a pretty scary effect, and it can happen behind closed doors. And unfortunately, cyberbullying can also lead to suicide as well. In fact, according to David D. Luxton's study, 10 sites listed for a search for a total of 240 different sites, approximately half were pro-suicide websites, and that those websites provided factual information about suicide. Now, that's only one way that the internet can spark suicide. There's a couple other ways as well. First, we see that there are suicide pacts. Now, suicide pacts are often made on the internet between two or more people deciding that they're going to commit suicide together. So with such easy access to the internet, anyone can look up anything, and it can become extremely dangerous. And in fact, there actually are some websites that can actually show one how to commit suicide. So with social media being such a prominent part of this generation, there are dangers like mental health effects, personality changes, cyberbullying, and suicide. Now, this is only the surface of effects that are out there. Gen Z is the future of adults, and learning how to cope with social media and learn how much time we should be spending on social media is extremely important. There was another study done by Melissa G. Hunt through 143 undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania, and the study was to have the students limit the time on social media by 10 minutes per day per platform for 3 weeks. The results showed that by limiting the amount of social media use, the students felt less lonely or had less FOMO. After the study, the results Hunt recommended using social media for 30 minutes a day for the bettering of mental health. Gen Z is a very important generation for the future, and limiting the amount of social media can stop and avoid those effects like depression, anxiety, cyberbullying, and even suicide.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Appreciate that. Let's just bring it really home here. You're a member of this generation. Mm-hmm. You're as susceptible to this as everybody that you referenced in your speech. Mm-hmm. How do you cope? How does Emma deal with the things that you just laid out for us as being very difficult for your generation to deal with? Some practical steps.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really funny because my internship is social media this semester. But then also on top of that, I've had a lot of my classes have been talking about social media. I wrote a different speech a couple weeks ago on why we should take a break from social media. And yet for myself, I haven't fully taken on those steps yet, but I am wanting to. I think once school is over and my summer job starts, it'll be a little bit better for me to kind of just step away a little bit. For me personally, I don't feel like those effects have affected me, but maybe I just haven't been looking for them. And so now that I've had all of these classes and speeches talking about the effects of social media, it's kind of brought more attention to me going, well, if those effects aren't affecting me right now, then I need to keep an eye out for them for later, if that makes sense.
Sure. So you graduate in a few weeks, and you enter an interesting world at the moment, but one that is clearly dominated by social media. Do you have some ideas moving forward about how you're going to manage that, or how, even if the Lord blesses you with a husband and some kids, how you're going to handle that in a family way? Do you have some, based on your 4 years of study here now, some things that you're going to try to put in place for yourself?
I think, like I was saying before, putting in or watching for those effects in the future is very important. So let's say, for an example, I'm getting a communications degree. Let's say, for example, I'm getting a job in social media. I think it's very important to separate the job aspect rather than the personal life. So if I'm constantly on social media for a job, then it's like, well, I'm going to go home and make sure to be with my family or my friends, or maybe later on in the future with my husband and kids, and completely separate that. But other than that, I think just taking small steps of, there's a couple social media apps on my phone that I don't even use. But it's like, why are they still on there if I don't use them? So, taking those steps of maybe deleting those. And some people can just completely just cut off social media and they're totally fine. But since I am a part of Generation Z, I grew up with this technology, it's a little bit harder for me personally just to completely wash it all out. But I think taking those few steps and getting there is important.
Thank you. Your speech hit on a topic that time didn't allow you to tease out a little bit, mm-hmm. But the whole concept of the distributed self that social media affords, the opportunity to have different personas that you put out there. Talk about that as a Christian. Mm. What is a Christian response to the whole notion of distributed self? Yeah, that topic is really interesting because coming from somebody who have a lot of friends with different kind of profiles, there's even this thing called a Finstagram where you make a fake Instagram account and you just like dump photos on there. It's not like oh, here's my perfect life and stuff like that. So I think coming from a Christian, if we were to have social media, it should be who we are completely, not just our happy and perfect sides. I've seen posts about people being very real on Instagram or Facebook or something like that. And I think that's the way that we should handle that. And it shouldn't be like, oh, let me make this fake profile of myself, or let me go on and make 3 different Facebooks and all of them have me from different times of my life. If we're going to have it, we should be able to put our real selves on there and not feel like we are happy and perfect, like I was talking about in my speech. Last question. What teaching from the pulpit, from the Sunday school class, from the VBS lessons, what teaching on this topic should the church be providing young people right now? I think probably when it comes to, like I was talking about with mental health issues, if a church were to get up and talk about social media, I would hope that they would bring out some of these effects that could happen. And like I was saying earlier, kind of bring out those, like, if you don't feel like you're struggling with it right now, but like just later on, watch for the future. If you're getting yourself into a habit of staying up until 3 a.m. on Instagram, or if you're creating different profiles and all this stuff, like just watch out for that stuff and possibly give those steps on, like, if you feel like you're struggling, here's some steps to help you with that. Great. Thank you, Emma. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Anaiah Wilson-Poston, and I'll be talking about worship and justice. So there are many things to think about when we're trying to understand justice in our world. Personally, when I'm trying to understand justice, one of the things that happens is my mind goes directly to the injustices of the world. So what do you think about when you think about injustice? Maybe your mind goes directly to the latest news channel you tuned into, or perhaps it goes to the person that you saw on the side of the road with a sign asking for resources of some kind. Or maybe it's a TV commercial with children that are in need. The truth is, there are many different injustices in our world, and we all interact with them in different ways. I wasn't always aware of that truth. I had only one way of thinking about justice, and that was through the lenses of injustices that I felt directly impacted my experience. And that experience was that of an African American woman living in America. And so when I thought about injustices, the only ones that I could think about were when it came to people like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many others. I never thought about homelessness or starvation or a pandemic being a form of injustice, at least not until I became a Christian. I always thought that in order for something to be considered injustice, something had to be done unto a person or a group of people, which is true, but that's only one way of thinking about injustice. I needed a new perspective to even begin to understand how worship and justice correlate. I was reading a book called Becoming Friends, and it was all about justice and that relationship with God. And author Paul J. Waddle gives this definition for justice. He says, justice is the virtue of right relationship or friendship with God, with other human beings, and with the whole of non-human creation. When I read that about justice, I feel like I was getting a sneak peek into a new perspective that was actually already an old perspective. It was the original perspective of what God had for us in the garden. I think I started to forget that the original plan of God didn't breed injustice. The original plan of God bred peace and friendship among his creation, both human and non-human. So this is true about justice. And I think it's safe to say that anything that distorts this harmony, this original plan that God created, is a form of injustice. And that is a result of the fall of Adam and Eve when they were tempted by Satan in the garden. This also means that it's Satan who breeds injustice, not God. So you may be wondering at this point, how does this relate to worship? Well, before we can answer that, we need to think about what it means to worship. And as a worship leader, I think about this all the time. I ask myself, what does it look like? What does it mean to worship? And I've come up with a lot of different things, but one of the things that has stayed with me is the fact that worship is not just about the songs we're singing or the flow of service, but it's also about valuing God above all things. And I think that part of valuing God above all things means that we are to value what God values. And I believe that we have a God that values justice. And I think that's written many places in Scripture, but I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first example is from Matthew 22. At this point, Jesus is being asked, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your heart. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." So I believe that loving God fully is part of what it means to worship, and to love God fully also means loving his people. And love consists of sacrifice and releasing control of certain things and having a true concern for whatever it is you're loving. And the second example is from Exodus 2. It says in Exodus 2:23 through 25, it says, "During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." So we have a God who cares about the struggles that we're going through in our lives and the injustices that are coming up in the world. So not only was God concerned about the Israelites in their slavery, but he also later promises in Exodus 6 that he'll deliver them out of their slavery. So that's a representation of a God who truly cares about his people and does not wish them to be chained to any kind of injustice, which again proves that he is not the breeder of injustice. So if part of worship means to value God above all things, and we do that by valuing what God values, and we've seen that God values justice through these 2 examples, then what does that mean for us? Well, I think that means that we need to pursue justice in and outside of our traditional worship settings. And as a worship leaders, I will outline 4 things that I think that we can pursue justice. We can pursue justice in our worship settings. So the first thing is this. I think we need to change our mindset a little bit and add to our definition of worship. I read a book, and it was called The Dangerous Act of Worship. And The author created this thing called dangerous worship, and I was like, I don't understand that. How can raising our hands be dangerous? But then as I looked a little closer, I started to understand what he meant. So if we look at the definition of danger to be causing harm to someone or something, then when we're thinking about dangerous worship, we need to think about what is being harmed in our worship and who is being harmed in our worship, which again is a crazy concept, but there is an answer. So the what that's being harmed in this context is evil and injustice, and the who that's being harmed is the breeder of evil and injustice, which is Satan. But I'd also argue that another part of who and what is being harmed is our human desire, our old flesh, the life that we had before coming to meet Jesus. And the problem with that is our flesh causes us to stay in a box, and it blocks us from being an example of Jesus. When I think about Jesus, I thought about how he invited to his table of love, mercy, and forgiveness and salvation. He invited those who are unwanted, oppressed, unloved, and exiled. And he invited them to his table. And sometimes we will stay in our box, and that's not an example of Jesus. So our flesh can get in the way of that. So when we are dangerously worshiping, we are committing to valuing what God values, and that means we have no choice but to step outside of our box. And the next three things that I think are important to think about when we're pursuing worship, when we're pursuing justice in our worship settings, are to see, engage, and love. Now, back in 2020, when we all had to go back home during the pandemic, I had this experience with the church. I was leading worship at a church, and then, like I said, we had to go home. And shortly after that, we learned about the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and my heart was just filled with sadness and anger, and the world was in an uproar, and I felt like no one really cared about what the other person felt or what the other person needed, and I felt like no one cared about what I needed or what I wanted. But there were two church leaders in this church that Instagram messaged me, and they said, Anaiah, how are you doing during this time? How do you feel, and what do you need? So they saw what was happening in the world, and then they brought it down to their context of the church that they were leading and what community members would be affected by what was happening in the world. So they saw that. And then they engaged by messaging me on Instagram and starting that conversation and asking me how I felt. And they were loving me too by sacrificing their time and by relinquishing any kind of control or any kind of want to have an argument or debate. They just wanted me to come as I was with any emotions that I was feeling. And they also showed me their genuine concern for how I was feeling and how I was being affected. And I think that that's something that we can do as worship leaders. I think as worship leaders, we can create services that allow people to have time to grieve and lament and to bring their prayers not only for what's happening in the community of the church, but what's happening outside of the community of the church. And we can bring that together. And I think that when we are doing that, we are fully engaging into the fullness of God and what he has for us.
Very good, Anaiah. Thank you for sharing those things. Let's continue discussing for a second what you ended up with as a worship leader. You gave us a couple of good general ideas of what worship leaders can do in regard to this. Now, take it to the next step. Practically speaking, what resources are you going to use? What songs might you sing? What prayers might you pray? So just take it out of the realm of the general and give me a few specifics.
Sure. I think some of the specifics will definitely depend on like what church context you're at and what their understanding and what they're willing to go with. But I also think that means like you have to know your congregation, and that means like having meetings with the other leaders of your church. But I know there's one song in particular that's actually a new song, and it's by Maverick City, and it's called Jubilee, and their words like point to justice. So I think that if we like take the time to go research different songs that talk about those things, like we can help our community understand the pursuit of justice and why it's important. And one of the chorus in that song specifically says, listen to the free man singing, he's delivered me. Listen to the woman shouting, his garment made me clean. Listen up, he's rebuilding everything. Listen to the people shouting, this is Jubilee. And it's also like the celebration of when we're actually seeking that right relationship with God, we're all coming together. And I think that that's pleasing to the Lord. So that's one example.
Yeah. You mentioned Mark Laberton's The Dangerous Act of Worship.
Mm-hmm.
Give me 2 or 3 other resources that you found helpful as you've put this presentation and this paper together, where anybody who's interested could go and check out some more information.
Sure. So I used, The Dangerous Act of Worship by Mark Laberton, and then I used Becoming Friends by Paul J. Waddle. And then the other one was called The Holy No, Worship as a Subversive Act. I can't remember who the author of that one is. And then I read another book, which was basically just, it had like a list of Bible studies that you could walk through as an individual, or you could walk through as a group of people for learning about justice and putting it in context of Scripture.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Flashback to those Instagram messages from the folks at the church,
Mm-hmm.
which in hindsight seem very much Holy Spirit prompted.
For sure.
What's your state of mind in regard to where we are now versus where we were when those folks felt prompted to send you messages? How have we grown? What work do we have to do yet? Anything like that?
I think we've grown in a sense of educating ourselves, educating each other, listening to each other. I've experienced like injustices like this before in years past, but I don't think that I experienced the amount of like communication or arguments or debates that we had during 2020. And so I do think that there was value in having those conversations. I think that we still need to work on having a conversation and not a debate and not an argument and not the left, the Democrats or the Republicans are right or wrong or whatever. I think we just need to come to a point where we can hear the other person's side and still love them and respect them through that. I think that there will always be work that needs to be done, but I also think that if we are having a heart that wants to seek justice, I think that the work will just become more and more it will not have to it won't be as hard. It will still be hard, but it won't be as hard as it has been because we're understanding each other on a personal level and we're loving each other and respecting each other and understanding that seeking justice is a part of God's will.
Yeah, thank you. Last question.
Mm-hmm.
In regard to any of the communities in which you would call yourself a member,
Mm-hmm.
church family, family of origin, Judson family, choir family, DCWPA family, what about any of those communities propels you forward with hope for the future?
Well, I mean, if you want to use choir, for example, I feel like everyone is always trying to have a good conversation with someone and listening. I also feel like the DCWPA and a lot of my classes have not been silent about these issues, and they've been respectful and acknowledging what's going on. And so that's been super helpful, and that like gives me a lot of hope that we're not just seeing what's happening in our world and seeing what's on the news and just sweeping it under the rug. We're actually thinking about ways that we can help each other and ways that we can step more into what God originally had for us.
Great. Thank you, Anaiah.
Thank you.